Either we conclude sadly that our hope of understanding the world passed away along with the celestial spheres and the four elements. Perhaps revelation is a loaded term for this situation. Let's think about that. Let's think about that. Let's think about that. Let's think about that.
Hello and welcome to Let's Think About That. Thank you for joining us for our inaugural episode. I'm joined here today by my co-host, Ben Troll, a recently minted Master of Theology. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So we are going to discuss some theological topics, and I picked one in particular, the notion of spiritual injunction. This was a Ken Wilber thing, which I found really interesting, where he's also talking about science and spirituality, like generally considered. And he kind of considers, he thinks that most people, like at post-enlightenment, consider science to be about objective things, about what is in the object, about things you can see, you can measure, you can divide, categorize, etc. Things outside. The things in your mind, like the subjective experience of like being a person, your likes, dislikes, beliefs, emotions, all those things are not scientific because you can't divide those. You can't measure them the same way. They're not in an object. There's something that you were like they're interpretations that you're imposing. So it pretty much just writes that off completely and just says that is nothing. What is real is like what you can see and measure outside in the surfaces of objects. And then he argues that there's not really a good reason to do that, because you could still have a science, he thinks, of spiritual pursuits to some extent, because he thinks that one of the foundational elements of modern science and the scientific method is that you can have an experimental injunction. So if you want to see the moons of Jupiter, build a telescope according to these parameters and then look through it, and you will see the moons of Jupiter. And if you don't believe me, do that, and then tell me that you still don't believe me that it's there. Or the same thing with any kind of, there's an experiment that shows a result. And so the whole model of scientific study is to produce these replicable experiments that anybody could theoretically do and see the result that you're talking about. So you don't have to insist that you just have to take my word for it or it's dogma. It's like, if you do this, you will see it. And so I feel like that's actually a really common topic right now among both more highbrow and lower-brow thinkers. Like, you got a guy like Ken Wilber talking about that, and you got even people like Joe Rogan who are really, he brings in sensory deprivation and psychedelics and meditation a lot. But Ken Wilber and more sophisticated thinkers do as well. And I think it's because they feel that those things are similar to an experimental injunction. So it's not just saying like, God is this way and this is how we're related to him because it was revealed to certain individuals that that's the case. He would be saying somebody like a Buddhist sage or something could be like, this is the way that things are, and this is the true human nature. And if you want to experience that fact, meditate in this manner for 20 years, and then you will see it. Or the world is X way. If you want to see it, take LSD and you will see that that is the case. Or at least that the reality that you perceive right now is not everything that's there. And if you take LSD, you will see it is a guarantee. Something will happen and your consciousness will be changed radically and you will see things completely differently. And so a lot of people are wondering if you actually could have sort of a science of spiritual things by trying to streamline these kind of injunctions. And that part of the injunction process is that, how would I put this? Also entailing that injunction is that you would do it, and then once you've done it, you would come back and report what you saw to other people who are qualified, who have knowledge of the that experience and have done it themselves, and you compare your findings, say, I saw this, and everybody else says, I saw the same thing. I agree. And through that, you kind of build up a consensus as to what is like objectively true. So that's also a big topic, but I think that might be kind of interesting to riff on, because I think the reason that a lot of kind of public intellectuals that are popular right now tend to kind of lean into that sort of like actual exploration of the interior, because it's something that anybody can, that's something that you could do yourself. And so it seems more scientific. And a religion like Buddhism isn't making claims based on revelation, at least in its strict form. It's just saying, if you do these practices, this will help relieve the suffering that you feel. And so there's just kind of a more scientific vibe to it. And so it makes me wonder about the relationship between those kind of pursuits and a religion based on revelation like Christianity and Catholicism
and Judaism
and Islam. Yeah, Judaism, Islam, and kind of how those two things compare, and if there's a way that you could, that those religions based on revelation could somehow be made to gel a little bit more with that kind of scientific injunction way of seeing things. Because there are contemplatives in Christianity and in Islam and Judaism. Like, there are people who spend huge amounts of time alone in prayer and contemplation and have these experiences, like Teresa of Avila, for instance, John of the Cross. I forget the name, but there's a Jewish rabbi who is famous for similar kind of having visions and coming to a really deep realization about the relationship of humanity to God, or even of kind of just completely the self melting away and becoming just completely filled with God. Teresa of Avila kind of talks about that a little bit. So it's not like there isn't a mystical or contemplative tradition in Christianity. I'm just using that because I'm most familiar with the language and the characters of Christianity. But it seems like there could be some crossover, but typically those type of things tend to be sort of bracketed off by authority figures as kind of the purview of special individuals.
Perhaps I think there's a tremendous deal of historical ignorance at work in the underpinnings of that view of the way Christianity has worked. And what I mean by that is the idea that there have been these sort of all-powerful authority figures in Christianity who've been able to tell people what to do, what to think, what not to think, and that they've just been obeyed repeatedly for roughly 1,500 years, until about the time when someone like Martin Luther came along and said, no, we're not going to do that. You're sort of deifying the act of saying no, which you can see in a lot of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment views, that the value of the individual lies in being able to say no. There's some truth to that, but I think it's founded on a historical inaccuracy, or if not, maybe not quite an inaccuracy, but when you're surrounded by, just to stick with the historical situation first, when you're surrounded by an extremely tense and stressful historical circumstance, you tend to forget the times when it wasn't that way. Mm-hmm. And you kind of project the current situation onto the entire past. And I think that's very much true of the of the Reformed narrative about Christian history, because it was not always, there was always a great deal of tension for the first 1,500 years, and it ebbed and flowed between civil authorities and ecclesiastical authorities, between groups of bishops and the Pope. The Pope was not always this all-powerful individual. So I would say that already the idea that mysticism as a sort of firsthand experience of the divine has been restricted by authority figures in Christianity or in Judaism or Islam. I don't know quite as much about the history there, but again, I'm working from within Christianity. The idea that somehow the church has censured the mystics until enough of the mystically minded people gained critical mass and overthrew the sort of the institutional church for all intents and purposes. That's not historically true, or at least it's not historically refined. And I think if you undermine that historical viewpoint, you would already be seeing Christianity, at least in a different light, which would in turn affect how you're going to see Christianity in relation to one of these more experimental injunctions type religions. I would say that'd be the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it wasn't always the case that Christians, the idea of revelation in Christianity, obviously there's language of revelation in the New Testament, even in the Old Testament, but the distinct concept of revelation didn't really acquire a definite form from the standpoint, at least of the Catholic Church, until the Second Vatican Council in the Dogmatic Constitution on divine revelation. And that came to prominence as a subject of inquiry because of the split with the Protestants in the 1500s. So again, the concept of revelation, what constitutes revelation, how are we supposed to accept revelation, to what degree can we approach it critically, those are all, from the standpoint of the 2,000-year-old Catholic Church, those are all relatively recent questions.
Sure.
And there were developed something similar to the kind of experimental injunction approaches to revelation, which no one talks about anymore, very few people talk about anymore, called the motives of credibility.
The motives of credibility, okay.
And these were pioneered by the apologist era in Catholic theology,
which was
would have been around the 16th to the 17th century, during a great deal of, probably maybe larger than that, but from the time of the Reformation, because you initially have Catholic apologists dealing with the Reformation, but
Sure.
Increasingly, like with science, pointing back to the whole subject of science and experience, you have also the growing question, not of just Catholicism questioned by Protestantism, but of Christianity questioned by people who are saying, well, what about science? Mm-hmm. So you have this developing need for not only Catholics, but Christians in general to be able to respond to the criticisms of offered by science. And there were people who at least actually quite a few Thomists, who were of the opinion that, at least in principle, the faith can't be, what you hold by faith can't actually be contradictory with respect to itself. So the actual propositions that say Christ rose from the dead, that can't be contradictory. And it's true that they would say that can't be contradictory. Therefore, any opinion that says it's impossible for someone to rise from the dead can't be true. They're starting from the standpoint of faith. But their goal is not necessarily to disprove every contrary claim, but at least to show they're not necessary arguments. And we could talk about what would constitute a necessary argument. There's a whole epistemological tangent we could go on. But there's the intrinsic intelligibility that's required of the articles of faith. But then there are the motives of credibility leading up to that, which are rationally examined facts associated, in Christianity's case, it's associated with the life of Christ, the miracles of Christ, the early church, like all you looking at historical facts and saying, if you look close enough, you will see things that suggest, they don't prove because the faith can't be proved, but they at least suggest that it's not impossible that this is true. One case in point would be, there's the C.S. Lewis is actually, I don't know if he would have referred to it in these terms, but he's offering an attempt at articulating a motive of credibility when he talks about the famous trilemma. I don't know if you've heard of it, where
I'm not familiar with that. No.
Talking about the identity of Jesus, mm-hmm. where Jesus says something like,
is it he's either a liar or a lunatic?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah. Go ahead.
Either he says, I'm the Son of God. Either he's a liar, which if he's that kind of public liar, you would think, just from experience, you'd think that he would be, that kind of moral failing would make itself felt elsewhere in his life. But the reputation that even non-believers accord to Jesus as at least a sage of moral wisdom would seem to belie that impression. He's crazy. That's the second option. But if he's crazy, then you wouldn't expect shrewdness or intelligence in other areas of his teaching and his life, but his parables and his interactions with the Pharisees, assuming obviously that you're going to believe the gospel presentations, taking that as for granted for now. If you're going to believe those, it's like, well, based on these presentations, he doesn't seem like a liar. He also doesn't seem crazy. The other option is, well, it's at least possible that he is who he says he is, which is, the Son of God, the second, and he wouldn't maybe have articulated it in these terms, but the second person of the Trinity, and so on. But that's an attempt to show it in a way. It's imitating that kind of experimental injunction, which is saying, look, there are things you can do, there are ways you can examine the Christian claim prior to assenting to revelation, but which are critical and rational approaches to what the church claims to have received as revelation. And that's, historically speaking, that was the task of theology was twofold. The task of theology, as practiced not just by St. Thomas, but by the entire patristic tradition, the task of theology was to do two things. First was to illuminate and delineate the intrinsic intelligibility of the articles of faith that I was talking about. The claim Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus is the Son of God. Those are claims that, like, okay, what is that? What would that mean? What would those terms mean in light of the other things we claim? But the other thing theologians have been responsible for doing is showing those claims, those primary claims of faith, are at least not contradictory and not impossible. So there's been a great effort. There's one of the reasons that that Christianity in particular, has had a close relationship with philosophy, is that it has always been convinced, and with greater degrees of intensity. I think that you can't say that, the Christians have always been committed to 100% non-dogmatic, in the negative sense, rational argument. That's not always been true. But among Christian theologians, the ideal has always been confidence in the power of reason to, Catholic theologians, confidence in the power of reason to, if not prove the faith, at least assist in seeing the reasonability of assenting to it. So already, I think, just to kind of sum up what I've said, the idea that Christianity versus, say, an experimental injunction religion like Buddhism, that they're opposed because in Buddhism you have the authority figures saying, do this and you'll see what I mean, versus in Christianity, authority figures saying, no, just believe this and don't ask questions. That's founded, I think, on, like I said, if not complete historical inaccuracy, it's not founded on a refined view of the history. And the second thing is that, kind of building on that approach to looking at history, is that Christian theology has very often and for a long time appealed to something similar to an experimental injunction, which is, appealing to the motives of credibility, appealing to, well, you have rationality and the facts are before you. These aspects of the facts before you, based on the paradigm of rationality that we have, would suggest that it is at least it's not simply a leap into the dark to say, I believe that Christ is the Son of God. I believe that Christ rose from the dead. I believe that he founded the church. Like, those are all claims which can still be contested, but they're not, a Christian doesn't hold to them simply on a kind of blind confidence in, well, it was told to me by people I trust, therefore I'm just going to accept it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that in a lot of ways that is a bit of a caricature that is common now. That is not fair. I mean, I agree with that aspect of what you said, but I would also say that in my experience, and it seems like taking the pulse of the moment, that really is not something that is emphasized in popular Christianity, it seems to me. But that's why I brought up the mystical traditions of saints like John on the Cross or Teresa of Avila, or even a character I came across in reading recently, Meister Eckhart. Have you ever heard of him? Yeah, another similar a Christian thinker who, a lot of what he said, a lot of his public speeches had a lot of traces of non-duality type of ideas, which are much more common in things like Buddhism, kind of the ultimate identity of self and God, that there really isn't a difference, like that duality actually doesn't really
Atman
exist.
equals Brahman kind of idea.
Yeah, which it's very odd to hear a Christian thinker, especially at that time in kind of the Reformation era, to be saying things like that. So it's not like there isn't a tradition of that. And the way I haven't read much John of the Cross, but I have read uh, Teresa of Avila,
Interior Castle.
The Interior Castle. I was looking at my bookshelf to see The Interior Castle. And that also seems to be, she wouldn't have phrased it as an experimental injunction, but the fact that it is listed as a step-by-step process of how the soul can come to union with God, essentially. And it is literally a journey with steps, with practices that have to be undertaken in order to get to the next step, that involves a gradual diminishment of the self and the ego, and an acceptance of God within the individual, which is very similar to the general practice of what people are seeking when they undertake extensive meditation or contemplation, or even psychedelics to some extent, that you're trying to radically change the positioning of your ego in relation to the rest of the universe. And so what I'm interested in is that it seems like there is a tradition within Christianity that really emphasized that, but that is not an aspect of Christianity that seems to be at all at the fore in today's Christianity. And that many Christians are lamenting the fact that there seems to be, every year, more and more people are migrating away from Christianity. And there also seems to be this growing popularity of Buddhism in the more popular, diluted version of just general mindfulness that seems to be extremely popular right now. Much more interest in social acceptability of psychedelics, and serious academics talking about it publicly, and a lot more people experimenting with it, it seems like. Some of whom seem to report extremely positive results, others extremely negative. And that's not an area I wanted to get into too much, but there's a reason, I think, why that has become so popular alongside the mindfulness revolution, meditation, things like that. And so I wonder if there's anything you can think of, that anything that the Christian tradition could tap into that would be more in line with something like that, an experimental injunction. Because I understand with the motives of credibility, that makes sense, but I think a lot of people would say that I want more than just a plausible set of rational conditions. A lot of people are like, sure, the trilemma of C.S. Lewis, I get that. I feel like thinkers like Jordan Peterson kind of acknowledge that. They're like, yeah, it could have been the Son of God, and there are good reasons to think that that's potentially true. But it doesn't have that added step of saying, and if you want to know that that's true, do this.
See, that's
what's interesting.
That's what I would have to say. That I think actually the current,
and maybe that's unreachable. Maybe that's not.
I don't know if it is unreachable. I think that, okay, there are several things I want to say. First, just to add some more characters to the Christian tradition to which you alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
People like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross are members of the Carmelite tradition, which the Carmelite order is one of several later, I think, medieval orders. I don't know much about the history of it. I know that they come to prominence in the later Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, if I'm not mistaken. But they trace themselves to, they're trying to revive the general monastic spirit. The monastic movement in Christianity has a very, very ancient
all the way back to the Desert Fathers.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up, the Desert Fathers, that with the social acceptability, with the Edict of Toleration that Constantine published, within several decades, you had people, old Christians, who could remember the periods of persecution when it was a decision. It was an existential decision to go to church. It was an existential decision to publicly identify as a Christian, because your life could mean death.
Your life would literally be on the line.
Whereas once you're tolerated, that sense of urgency, that sense of decision, was diminished, and the emergence of the monastic movement in Egypt under Saint Anthony the Great was a response to that sense of, okay, we need to revive that sense of urgency, revive that sense of contact with Christ. So from the Desert Fathers, you eventually have people that it spreads all throughout the East in Christianity. It takes a while to get started in the West. But you have even people like St. Augustine, who's not famous for anything monastic, in the public eye. St. Augustine wrote a rule for monastic orders. He wanted to be a monk himself, but was pressured by several bishops in North Africa to become a bishop because he was wickedly intelligent and they needed someone to help them deal with things. But you have John Cassian, who was sent to the East by the Pope to come up and try to distill what's going on over there, distill the monastic experience. Cassian, Gregory the Great. Well, I should get Benedict, the father of monasticism, the father of the Benedictine order, and what we would know of as Western monasticism. Gregory the Great, the entire Middle Ages, which is, from the monastic standpoint, the entire Middle Ages up until the emergence of the mendicant orders like the Franciscans or the Dominicans, the entire Middle Ages is an extended Benedictine era in which the Benedictines are trying to reform themselves and remain faithful to Benedict's original plan, which was always the whole goal of monastic life. And it's a goal. The idea is that it's a journey, like you were saying. There's a sense of we have to live a certain way in order to follow out the steps to union with God. And for Benedict, he said most people are weak and need a community to help them remain faithful to that commitment. But from the Desert Fathers through Cassian, through Benedict, all the way into the West, into the medieval West, you have a great sense of the spiritual life is a journey, much like life itself is a journey. So that's the first thing I would say, is just to kind of broaden out, maybe at length, to broaden out some of the tradition to which you were alluding. Another thing I would say is that, kind of in response to the idea that the modern church, unfortunately, is so racked with internal strife that it is not, and I think Jordan Peterson has actually done a very good job of calling out the church on this. When he is, in several of his interviews with Bishop Barron, he's basically said, unselfconsciously, not rudely, but genuinely wondering, like, I feel like I shouldn't have to do much of this.
Yeah, I remember that interview. Yeah.
And it's true. I think that the church, I would agree with you that from the standpoint of its public leaders, the church is not doing a great job of appealing to that need, that desire for contact with the divine. And they could do a much better job. But the caveat, not necessarily a caveat, the final thing I would want to say, though, wouldn't necessarily, I don't want to say a word of caution, because I want to be open to the idea. But I think that, let me put it this way, in the case of what you're talking about, the idea of the self dissolving into union with God, I think of someone like Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict. And his great insight was that Christianity is always a religion of dialogue. It begins with Christ, at least in the Gospel of John, it begins with Christ walking up to people and saying, "Follow me." Or at least in the Gospel of John, it's the two disciples come up to him after St. John the Baptist points to him and says, "Behold the Lamb of God." They go up to Jesus and they say, "Where are you staying?" And he says, "Come and see." So right from the get-go, Jesus himself, even within the Catholic Christian understanding of him, Jesus invites that kind of enter the journey, seek and you will find, follow me and live the way I live, and you'll experience, you will come to an experience of divine sonship or divine daughterhood, which approximates something that I have with the Father. Like that's to be somewhat imprecise about it, like that's the core of what's really being said in the gospel.
Would that, just to interject real quick, would that be along the lines of saying that a perfect imitation of Christ as he's portrayed in the Gospels, just throwing this out there, could that be something similar to an injunction? If you live that way, then you will experience the type of union that I have with the Father?
That's why I brought it up, because I realized that that should have been the first thing I said, is that it's that idea of the injunction is, that's Christ's injunction to follow me, come and see. That's the first thing prior to any business of the motive of credibility. So shame on me for not bringing that up earlier.
He does also say things like "love each other as I have loved you."
He's always the standard. He is always the standard. But the fact that he is the standard, the fact that he refers to there's a constant language of me, my Father, me and you. In the farewell discourse of Jesus, John 14 through 17, there's Jesus constantly says something along the lines of, remain in me as I remain in you. I remain in my Father. If you remain in me, you will remain in my Father. And that may seem like, what are you talking about? What I'm getting at is, in Christianity, and this is one of the things that Ratzinger is very, very intense about, is that for Christianity, the I, thou, and they are irreducible aspects of human experience, to the point where, for the Christian tradition, union with God does not mean a dissolution of myself into God. It's always going to remain a dialogue. It's always going to remain, because for Christianity, the highest thing one can do, and the thing to which all are called, is to love God and to be loved by God. Love can only exist, as we know it from experience, love can only exist between two people. And even though lovers will talk about, it feels like we're one person, and yet the dynamism of love comes from the fact that what they have is a union of heart, but they're still two different people. And that's the beauty of constantly seeing life through the eyes of the other person. You're being lifted out of yourself, and
you are being changed as you change them.
Exactly. But in order to have that kind of dynamic relationship, you can't have a dissolution of the distinction. Even though so for the Christian, what's taking place, and this is definitely the case in the Carmelite tradition and the entire monastic tradition, the work of the spiritual life, the journey of the spiritual life, which you were talking about, that is a process of purification, a process of removing the things that are not actually authentically me. So when we talk about the death of the self in the monastic tradition, you're not talking about the death of what's genuinely me. You're talking about removing what has kind of accreted, kind of gathered onto me from my engaging in sin and the like. And the work of dying to self is a dying to the sort of the fallen experience of the self. So the goal isn't to lose yourself in the fullest sense. The goal is to purify yourself so that you can love God and be loved by God in a relation of an espousal relation. Like, that's the Song of Songs in the Old Testament is emphatic about that. And I think that would be one of the biggest obstacles to having a blending or a rapprochement between something like Buddhism, which I don't understand terribly well. I'll give you that. I need to study it more. But between something like Buddhism versus Christianity is that the primacy of the idea and the goal of love in Christianity precludes the possibility of a genuine loss of a real loss of the self into God, and it precludes the idea of a real identity in the fullest sense between the self and God. Because if you have an identity between the two, love isn't actually possible at that point. It might be blissful, or it might be nirvana, like they say it would, an experience of absolute utmost peace. But it wouldn't be love, which I think, at least in human experience, the experience of love is, I think, the most visceral experience of being more visceral, an experience of being lifted out of yourself than simply staying alone in your room contemplating. I think that, at least in the Christian tradition, monks aren't simply contemplating and just kind of like trying to lose themselves in God. Monks are contemplating to purify themselves, to become better lovers of God, and eventually to become victim souls, the idea of offering themselves to God for the sake of others in imitation of Christ. So love is always the standard. Love is always the criterion in Christianity. And I think that would be the obstacle you'd have to overcome if you want to, anytime you want to, I think someone like Thomas Merton, who I have not read terribly much of, he wanted more of a crossover between East and West on this point. But I think that the problem that you would encounter trying to do that would be anytime you want to integrate an insight, like say a practical meditative insight from Buddhism. If you were wanted to integrate that into Christian practice, you would have to find a way to translate it into something that would involve this dialogue between my soul or myself and God. And if that dialogue never passes away, it would seem like it's kind of an insuperable obstacle to actually translate those insights, because they're founded on a completely different view of the goal, even though that they can look very, very similar. The goal is a union of type of one kind or another. But in Buddhism, as I understand it, based on what you've said, it's a union that involves a kind of confusion in a more technical sense. The distinction of the two terms is lost, and you have a single unitary. I don't know.
Well, I think I'm far from an expert on it myself. I'm kind of hitting you with things that we haven't really talked about before. But my understanding of it is it's less of a union and more of a remembering the way that you truly are, which is not existing as a separate me behind my eyes that looks out at things and experiences things. That there really is no such thing as that sense of the self that we have,
which is kind of fascinating.
Which is a huge, I agree, fundamental difference between Christianity and Buddhism is that in Christianity, as I think you've been implying, the idea of there being a self and a soul that is not identical with God, and that the love is a sort of participatory loop between the two, is different than Buddhism, which is largely a remembering of a forgotten state, which is that of just pure unadulterated being, pure unadulterated consciousness.
Now that's interesting because at least I think I had finished my previous point that the obstacle, like you're saying, the obstacle between integrating Buddhism, just for one example, and Christianity is that the idea of love, which is founded on we could put it this way, and this can kind of segue into the next point I wanted to make, is that the distinction between Buddhism and Christianity you could express as two different opinions about what is more real, or what should be given a primacy. Is distinction actually real, or is it illusory?
Right.
The Christian would say distinction is real, and so and distinction in a very, very general sense. Distinction is a real thing. The distinctions we experience around us are real. That doesn't mean they have the last word, but it does mean that any approach to union, anything you do is going to be conditioned by the reality of distinction. And for Christians, that ultimately comes down to the ultimate distinction is between God and created, being a created thing. Mm-hmm. That the distinction between uncreated and created never goes away. It always conditions everything that the Christian does and thinks, and accepting that, it's not impossible. Like there's a vast tradition within that monastic tradition we were talking about of a thing called theosis, which we would translate divinization. There is being lifted into a kind of union with God, but it's a union of adopted sonship, is what we would call it, which retains that sense of you are created, you are not God, and yet you're invited to share at God's table. So you're there as an adopted son. God wants to share his life with you, but you're still not God, but you're a friend of God in a way. Whereas in Buddhism, it seems like what you're saying, the idea of basically remembering past the illusion of distinction. And that implies that for the Buddhist, or for that kind of thinking, it's that distinction is not real. What's real is unity.
Yes.
And that the part of the reason I kind of interrupted while you were talking is that struck me that, to kind of return to the question of science and rationality, that tension between unity and distinction, before you see it felt historically at the level of religion between Buddhism, say, and Christianity, you see it in philosophy between the someone like Parmenides, who said, all is one, and then change and motion, all of that is illusion. All is one, really, versus someone like Heraclitus, who would say, no, all is change. Everything is actually, distinction is so prior and so primary that nothing is itself. Nothing is one. Everything is constantly in a state of flow. Like that tension between the idea of all things, and it's granted Heraclitus is weird because he also says it's wise to listen to me and say that all is one. But what he means by that is not the same thing.
That is true. And I think, to try to flesh this out a little bit, because I think it's important, I think my understanding of it would be that Buddhism would be more like the sense in which Heraclitus says that his flux is one. Because one of the central tenets of the original Buddha's teachings was that everything is impermanent, that nothing really is anything because it is constantly changing. And even things that we don't think are changing are just changing slower relative to other things. Like even the mountains that we feel are kind of the eternal guardians are changing. It's just over a long period of time and we don't notice it. So that nothing ever really is any one fixed thing. So in that sense, and that a big part of what makes human beings suffer is trying to hold on to things and keep them from changing despite the inevitability that they will pass away.
Yeah.
And that's why we suffer, which seems pretty universally
There's
true.
wisdom
I mean,
in that,
even
yeah.
in Christianity, I think I think Ecclesiastes would tend to agree with that type of vision of the world. But I think he would also say that everything is one in that sense, that you can't step into the same river twice, but you're still referring to the river. Like there is a oneness to that flux. Or another good analogy I've heard for the way that it's one is, and kind of what the realization that you're trying to come to through deep meditation is, you could be watching a movie and maybe Spider-Man is swinging between buildings, and you'd ask yourself, like, is that really happening? Like, well, something like that happened and it was filmed, but what you're really seeing are just pixels and lights, and you're seeing through that and projecting a story and interpretations on those pixels and lights that you see. But what they really are is just pixels and lights. And any segment of the movie, you could say, oh, I'm seeing Spider-Man right now, and I see a building behind him, and I see street lights and other characters. And they're like, yes, in a sense, that's what you're seeing. But in reality, you're just seeing a pattern of lights. And all of those things that you're referring to are equally the movie. And that the movie itself is that oneness, even though you're seeing difference, even though the patterns are different. What you are seeing is just pixels of light and identical in terms of substance, I guess you would say. And those are all one in the sense that the movie is just the context of all of those things. So that would be, I feel like a Heraclitean kind of unity. That it's,
within that view, though, of the unity of all things, and where I don't know if you can find an adequate example of nirvana using the analogy of the movie. But if we're going to say that all is one, how do you think a Buddhist explain then? Like, what is the pursuit of nirvana if the all is one in the sense of all being a single flux? What is nirvana at that point?
I think nirvana would be realizing the movie, understanding the oneness despite that impermanence. And I think they would take the route of looking at the radical interdependence of everything, that you can't really consider anything to be independent of everything else because everything is constantly interacting in this endless sequence of causes. So this is getting a little into this, but just to kind of flesh out kind of what I'm talking about. But the idea of being able to realize these things, I think the special character of a religion like Buddhism, or a school of thought, rather, I should say, like Buddhism, is that you can come to see this, as I've been saying, you can come to see this if you do these things.
Yeah.
And that the reason, and when you get into Buddhism, it becomes hard to talk after a while because they say, well, there's no reason for pursuing it. If you pursue it, you're off track or whatever. But you have to use language. So to pursue enlightenment, the reason you want to attain enlightenment or nirvana is ultimately, I think, the alleviation of suffering. And the reason that you suffer is because you're looking at things the wrong way. You're interpreting them the wrong way. And so the self is seen as a separate individual eye that sits behind your forehead, is seen as an illusion that's somehow separate from the movie, that is just as much that you are the movie just as much as anything else that you see.
Because I think,
stick with that analogy.
Because the reason initially that I had brought up philosophy at that point, and Parmenides and Heraclitus, was that it struck me as well that
all that was just to say that I think it's more in line with the Heraclitus version.
But in either case, because what I was getting at then was that, and that's actually illuminating. I had assumed it would be more like Parmenides, but that because Parmenides does speak about illusion a great deal. But that makes sense what you said. But in either case, it seems like the Christian devotion to the reality of distinction versus, say, the Buddhist conviction of the underlying unity of all things. That is going. You can kind of see that mirrored in the way you have the pre-Socratic philosophers versus the Socratic, Socrates, and then Plato and Aristotle. Like that triumvirate really sets the standard for the Western pursuit of wisdom, the Western approach to reason. That no, things really there is something out there that is a thing, and there's something which is stable. And this, I think, you can even just see an experience that, at least to give some warrant to what they're saying. Not everything. Yes, we're surrounded by change, but it's also clear that things are changing, and yeah, maybe they're changing more slowly, but there's something experienced which is, even if it's indirectly experienced, there's something which is permanent. For Plato, he would say, I don't know, Socrates is more interesting because of the questions he gets other people to ask.
Sure. Yeah.
But for Plato and Aristotle, say Plato is saying, no, that the forms are real, whatever they are, wherever they are. But he's saying, there really is something. He's explicitly trying to solve the problem posed by the tension between Parmenides and Heraclitus. He's saying, no, the forms are real. And Aristotle is saying that substances are real. Both of them are saying, yes, there's a unity to the flux of all things, but that doesn't override the fact that things are still this thing, that thing. Mm-hmm. And for Plato, that distinction between experienced substances, he might be more in line with a Buddhist approach to things, and just have a sense of there's another world, a higher realm of permanent things. For Aristotle, at least, you have this sense of substances are real, and the substances we experience are composed of form and matter. You have essence, you have accidents, and so on. So that he comes up with an elaborate and I think rather sophisticated and I think true explanation for at a certain level of abstraction.
Sure.
For the way how we can explain the fact that things do seem to stay the same and yet also be changing. The language we use implies both of those. It would come down to act and potency. We could go into that, but I think we can go all into that. But the point,
can bracket that.
The point is, for Plato and Aristotle, they're convinced that their conviction in the reality of distinction, the irreducible reality of distinction, that things really are this thing, that thing, and that even if all things are changing, that doesn't mean that all distinction is an illusion. If you see that kind of initial philosophical divide, you can also see why that there's, even though in later history, Christianity and the conviction of science and reason may have parted ways at some point, but at least initially, Christianity and the Western ideal of reason, the primacy of reason, because you alluded to the idea that for a Buddhist might caution you away from too great a reliance on reason.
Yeah, they would.
For in the West, Christianity and philosophy are initially partners in their conviction that truth matters, that reason, even if it is not altogether sufficient, is to be trusted as a path to truth, and that religion is about truth for the Christian. So I think that if you take a broader view of it, you can actually see in the West that the Enlightenment itself kind of is like the middle act of the Reformation. And it's not necessarily, how do I put this? The Enlightenment's love of reason, with a capital R, and the church that professes Christianity, they're divided more by immediate historical disputes, but they're far more similar than I think the Enlightenment would actually proponents of the Enlightenment would care to admit. And the way they differ is how they define reason and so on, and what its purview is. That's a different question. But the fundamental conviction that reason is to be followed, and reason is the light, and that for the Christian, for the Catholic, faith isn't opposed to reason. Faith is a partner with reason. Faith wants to guide reason, but precisely for that reason, it has to respect reason. Mm-hmm. I think that's another reason why it might be difficult for Christianity to enter into a kind of consensus-seeking dialogue with something like Buddhism, because there's also that kind of obstacle too, that for the Christian and for the Western man, reason is something you just can't part with reason. Even if you can't, for the Christian, rely altogether on it, you can't part with it doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
And because a Christian would say it doesn't, think about it more. Like that's constantly the response is think about it more, pray about it, never stop. Like think of Job, the story of Job. Even though Job doesn't get a direct answer, at the end of the story of Job, God doesn't commend the friends of Job who say stop asking and just deal with it. God commends Job and tells him, "You were in the right. Yes, it was right of you to do that. You go make sacrifice for your friends because they have actually sinned by telling you to stop seeking." I think that really captures the Christian and sort of what will become the Western ideal is that reason. There's something primal about the value of reason, which I think would make a rapprochement between Christianity and Buddhism and sort of the Western mind and the Eastern mind in a larger sense rather difficult, if not impossible. Which is not to say that you can't learn things from each other, but I don't know if I think they might be irreducibly distinct. It's just I would have to explore it more. But there seems to be something those are huge roadblocks. I would say between any kind of consensus seeking dialogue between those two. I've said a lot.
I think that's fair, but I don't know if you would necessarily need to arrive at a consensus or even a dialogue that was seeking after a consensus. I think what you would need is something similar. I don't know if you would need this, but I think it seems to me what people are looking for is something more that can be verified for themselves. And this kind of gets into another interesting thing that has been on my mind for the last couple of years is like the notion of peak experiences or transcendent experiences, and that people want those and usually consider those to be the capstones of their life, the biggest moments of their life. Some people experience that with nature, with a musical performance, or with dance, psychedelics, deep meditation, where people get to these states that they describe as immense peace, oneness, a lack of inner conflict. I think the elimination of inner conflict is big, and I think that has always been something that I feel like should be the primary goal of any spiritual tradition is to try to help people deal with inner conflict. I don't see how you can be happy being racked with inner conflict, among many other things. And I think people are interested in methods that can help them attain those type of experiences. And to me, I don't see any reason to think that there's anything wrong with that, and that most religions are founded off of somebody's peak experiences. You know, whether it be the archangel Jibril appearing to Muhammad and dictating the Quran, whatever that experience was, you know, whether that happened or not, it is described as a peak experience, and then that is passed down from the founder to the rest of the people. Or Moses going up and to the mountains and finding the burning bush. That would be something similar to a peak experience. And then the insights gathered from that experience are disseminated to the people to follow. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's interesting that everybody has a desire to have those kind of experiences and get those kind of insights, and that the idea of getting it, I don't want to sound too critical saying this, but the idea of getting it secondhand and not having those for yourself leaves something to be desired.
Although,
and I would say that there is, this occurred to me too, that we talked, I kind of want to get into this more, but we talked about the idea of like a profound imitation of Christ being a sort of injunction that you could follow, and you will experience union with the Father as he did. I think that's worth exploring. But there's also moments where, for instance, after the resurrection, when Thomas demands to see the stigmata, the marks of the nails on his hands and feet, and he shows him, and he puts his fingers in the wounds, you know, and he says, "Blessed are those who believe, but they have not seen," which that actually seems to imply that seeking that type of experiential confirmation of something transcendent is maybe lesser.
Well, there's a distinction, isn't there, between the actual peak experience itself and the verification of the experience? And actually, it's interesting because it does not say in the Gospel of John that St. Thomas actually put his hand into. This was actually very interesting. I took a class on, while I was finishing my master's, I took a class in the Gospel of John, and it's actually rather a disputed question whether or not that really took place, which is, that's maybe a moot point, but the point is that St. Thomas, confronted by Christ, actually realizes that there's a difference between just kind of accept the experience. Christ is in his presence. He's having the peak experience.
Okay.
And he doesn't, and for St. Thomas to say, no, the experience is possible for him. I'm stabbing in the dark here.
Well,
I want to put this, because it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. Because I think that every single, the pursuit of peak experiences, which I think in more philosophical terms would be the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of beatitude, that can't not involve someone giving you that experimental injunction. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be a reliance on somebody else, and I think you have to read the story of St. Thomas, just and that statement from Jesus, "Blessed are those who have not believed and yet who have not seen and yet have believed." You have to read that within the context of where it is in the gospel. That at this point, the apostles have spent all this time with Jesus. They've seen his miracles. He shouldn't need more confirmation.
Yeah. And really, that is an interesting way to look at it, because I do feel that that is an aspect of peak experiences that when people are going through them, the need for an explanation as to why it's happening or what is causing it ceases to be important. And that seems to be a universal characteristic when people describe these type of experiences, that they don't need reasons for it, and they don't even need to be able to explain it rationally to other people. They feel confident that what they experienced was more real, in fact, than what is occurring in their normal waking state, and it doesn't need justification rationally. So that is an interesting way to look at it, yeah. But I think that is probably enough for this session. I think we got...
Scrape the surface.
We scraped the surface. We went in some interesting directions, but it's something that I would like to discuss again, and particularly, like I mentioned, the injunction of imitating the life of Christ, because I have always found that to be the most fertile ground for my own spiritual seeking in the realm of Christianity, and something that I do feel is de-emphasized a lot of times, and that perhaps that might be an avenue which Christianity might be able to take in order to, I don't want to say compete, but in order to satisfy the hunger that seems to be out there, and to some extent compete, because if people are leaving Christianity for these other traditions in part because of the experimental injunctions that they offer, I do think that is an issue. Yeah. And that I think if there could be an avenue that they could take in order to have their own set of practices that one could do in order to not necessarily verify, but experience the Christian experience. I think that would be edifying.
I think the bottom line is, if the Christian believes that Christianity is true, they need to find a much better job of conveying that truth. And involved in that truth is going to be that the imitation of Christ, the friendship with Christ, which historically, in periods of time, in times past, has produced incredible saints. Right now, I think you're right to say that it's somewhat, at least at the top level, it's somewhat de-emphasized. And I think you're right to say that it is a kind of competition, because, and competition is too small a word for it. It's an urgency. If you really think it's true, you want people to know it, you want people to believe it, not because you want more people paying money, but because it's for their good. You want them to know the truth. So I think that I think you're right to say that this is something that really should be explored more. Bearing in mind, I think at least the conditions under which that exploration would have to be undertaken would have to be, like we were saying, at least like I was saying, the recognition of certain, at least initial obstacles.
Yeah, I don't think it could ever be the same, or that it would even have to, because certainly taking the route of doing a lot of LSD and meditating, those are not the same routes.
No.
Even though the territory that you arrive at can be similar, although not necessarily. So I don't think it has to be identical, but again, not to get too much into it, but I think like one of the reasons why psychedelics have become so popular, people say, is because the guarantee of profound effect. You aren't necessarily promised a good experience.
Mhm.
It could, in fact, be profoundly terrifying. However, you do know that if you take a certain amount of LSD, something will happen. You will have a profound experience that will be unlike anything you've ever had before, and the fact of your existence will become extremely, or the nature of your existence will fall into serious question, and you will have insights. And I think people are looking for, I don't know necessarily about guaranteed result, but something that they know can reliably help them get into these transcendent states in order to increase their spiritual capacity. I don't know who used it. It might have been Teresa of Avila, but who used this analogy that I remember encountering as a kid, that in heaven, in Christian heaven, that sounds kind of funny to say, but everyone will be equally happy, but not everybody is capable of holding the same amount of happiness as compared to a thimble versus a goblet. Both will be completely full, but some will be capable of holding more. And so I always think of these type of peak experiences as being increasing your spiritual volume. You're able to contain more potential happiness. And I suppose you could say, if you'll be perfectly happy no matter what, doesn't really matter if you're a thimble versus a goblet. But to me, it seems like if there's anything worth pursuing, it's increasing your capacity to understand and to be happy and to appreciate the beatific vision in whatever form that may finally be. And peak experiences seem to be one avenue towards that. And so that's why I think it would behoove the church to emphasize that and to come up with some kind of rubric and practices that might appeal to people looking for those experiences. I think that can only help.
There are more things I'd like to say, but obviously we intended to try to end it, and then we started down another avenue.
That's the intellectual life, folks. Anyway, thanks for joining me, Ben. That was enlightening.
I hope so.